There are over 1,500 gecko species on Earth, and today I am ranking every single one, from the gecko your grandma could keep alive, to one in the middle of this list that could cost you a finger. Stay to the end, because number one is not just the hardest gecko on this list. It is the one you are not even legally allowed to own. Beginner. These are the geckos you could actually bring home this weekend and keep alive for a decade. Leopard gecko. The leopard gecko is one of the most recognizable reptiles on the planet, and it earned that status by being genuinely unlike most other geckos in ways that actually matter. Native to the rocky semi-arid landscapes of Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Iran, this species belongs to the family Ebuphoridae, a group defined by one remarkable feature that sets them apart from the majority of geckos: fully movable eyelids. While most geckos clean their eyes with their tongues and have fixed transparent scales over them, leopard geckos blink. That sounds trivial until you realize how ancient and fundamental that difference is. They also completely lack the adhesive toe pads found on most gecko species, instead relying on small claws to grip rocky substrate across their natural range. In the wild, they store fat reserves in their thick carrot-shaped tails to survive periods of food scarcity, and they can voluntarily drop that tail if a predator grabs it, sacrificing the appendage to escape. Adults typically reach between 7 and 11 inches in total length, and in captivity can live up to 20 years, making them a genuinely long-term commitment. The captive breeding industry surrounding leopard geckos is staggering, producing well over 100 recognized color and pattern morphs, from albinos to high-contrast melanistic forms, making the leopard gecko arguably the most selectively bred lizard in the history of the hobby. Crested gecko. The crested gecko has one of the most dramatic comeback stories in reptile history, because this species was genuinely believed to be extinct for over a century, until a scientific expedition to New Caledonia, a French territory in the Pacific, rediscovered living populations, following the impact of tropical cyclone Fran. Within a few decades of that rediscovery, the crested gecko went from unknown to one of the top 5 most popular pet reptiles in the world, rise with almost no parallel in herpetology. Named for the distinctive fringed crests running from above each eye down the sides of the body, giving it an almost prehistoric silhouette. Adults reach 6 to 10 inches, including the tail. One key distinction from some of its relatives is that a dropped crested gecko tail does not regenerate, leaving a permanently blunt stump, which is visible on a large proportion of wild adults. These geckos also exhibit a fascinating color behavior called firing up, where their skin tone intensifies and becomes more saturated in response to temperature, humidity, or perceived threat, shifting from muted daytime tones to rich reds, oranges, and creams after dark. Gargoyle gecko. The gargoyle gecko gets its name directly from its skin, which is covered in dense irregular bumps and knobs that closely resemble the carved stone texture of Gothic architectural gargoyles. When this animal presses itself flat against bark in the rainforests of southern New Caledonia, the resemblance to rough stone is genuinely striking. Adults reach 7 to 9 inches and are notably stockier in build than their crested gecko relatives, with a wider, more angular head and a shorter, thicker tail. Unlike crested geckos, gargoyle geckos can fully regenerate a dropped tail, making them somewhat more resilient in that regard. Their diet in the wild is unusually varied for a gecko, encompassing fruit, nectar, insects, and occasionally smaller lizards, which gives them a generalist feeding strategy that translates well to captive care. Males are significantly territorial and will fight aggressively with other males, requiring separate housing in collections, but toward their human keepers they tend to be more docile and handleable than many other arboreal species. Their popularity in the reptile hobby has grown steadily in recent years, though they remain less common than crested geckos, and are generally considered a slightly more advanced choice. Madagascar ground gecko. The Madagascar ground gecko, marketed in the pet trade under the more striking name panther gecko, has quietly earned a reputation as one of the most beginner-accessible gecko species beyond the traditional leopard gecko, combining a manageable 5 to 7 inch adult size, with a docile temperament and care requirements broadly similar to those of other small arid habitat geckos. Endemic to the dry deciduous and spiny forests of southern Madagascar, this species possesses movable eyelids, placing it among the eyelid geckos, despite its Malagasy lineage, an unusual feature that connects it visually and behaviorally to more familiar kept species like leopard geckos. The brown and cream striped, or banded patterning visible on wild-type animals, has given rise to a small but growing morph market in captive breeding. Though the range of established morphs remains modest compared to the enormous leopard gecko industry. Habitat loss in southern Madagascar's increasingly threatened dry forest ecosystem makes wild populations a conservation concern, though the captive breeding population is sufficiently established. Collection pressure on wild animals for the pet trade is minimal. Thick-tailed gecko. The thick-tailed gecko is Australia's barking gecko in popular usage, a name earned by the surprisingly loud squeak or bark it produces when threatened, which is genuinely startling, coming from an animal that reaches just 5 to 7 inches long. Found across the scrubland and heath of southern Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales. This carphodactylid species stores fat reserves in its characteristically chunky carrot-shaped tail, which can be voluntarily shed if a predator grabs it, and subsequently regenerated as a somewhat different textured replacement. Unlike many gecko relatives, the thick-tailed gecko is notably tolerant of cooler temperatures, remaining active in conditions that would render most tropical gecko species completely torpid, which reflects its adaptation to the variable and seasonally cold climates of southern Australia. In the Australian reptile hobby, it is frequently recommended as a robust beginner species, responding well to captive conditions and tolerating regular handling more readily than many native gecko species. Bumpy tuberculate skin with brown and cream banding gives it a pleasingly prehistoric appearance that has earned it a dedicated following among Australian key. Mediterranean house gecko. The Mediterranean house gecko has quietly become one of the most successful reptilian colonizers of human infrastructure in the world, establishing thriving populations across the southern United States, Central America, and parts of Asia far beyond its native Mediterranean range by exploiting a single behavioral strategy: hunting moths, beetles, and other insects that congregate around artificial lighting on building exteriors at night. Adults reach 4 to 5 inches and display a distinctive pinkish semi-translucent skin, through which internal structures are faintly visible under direct light, giving the animal an otherworldly appearance that surprises people encountering it up close for the first time. Now established across Texas, Florida, and the Gulf Coast states, this species has proven tolerant of a far wider range of temperatures and humidity levels than most gecko relatives, which explains its persistence in environments outside its ancestral Mediterranean climate zone. The ecological impact of its introduced populations is generally considered relatively low compared to more aggressive reptilian invaders, though its interactions with native fauna in areas of overlap continue to attract research attention. The difficulty curve starts bending. These species need specific humidity, specific lighting, or a keeper who accepts they are display animals rather than pets. The gold-dusted gecko earns its name from a dusting of iridescent golden flecks across the neck and shoulders that shimmers visibly in direct sunlight, giving this small jewel-like lizard an almost ornamental quality. One of the smaller members of the genus Phelsuma, adults reach just 4 to 5 inches, giving them a more delicate appearance compared to the giant day gecko, despite sharing the same vivid green base coloration with red dorsal streaks. Native to Madagascar, the gold-dusted gecko has established invasive populations in Hawaii, the Comoros, and Mayotte following accidental introduction, and these populations are now self-sustaining and widespread in certain urban and agricultural environments. Like its larger relative, it participates in pollination ecology in its native habitat, developing close relationships with specific plant species, though the ecological implications of its introduced populations remain an active area of study. It is popular in the pet trade due to its manageable size and extraordinary coloration, though its care requirements, particularly the need for high humidity and UV exposure, place it beyond the casual beginner. Giant day gecko. The giant day gecko is the jewel of Madagascar's gecko fauna, a fully diurnal species with emerald green coloration and vivid red dorsal markings that makes it look less like a real animal and more like something designed for maximum visual impact. Part of the genus Phelsuma, which contains over 70 recognized species across Madagascar and surrounding Indian Ocean islands, the giant day gecko reaches up to 11 or 12 inches, making it one of the largest members of a genus that otherwise trends toward compact, delicate forms. Unlike the majority of gecko species, which are nocturnal, day geckos hunt insects and lap nectar during full daylight, and they play an ecologically meaningful role as pollinators, transferring pollen between tropical flowers as they feed. That same nectar feeding habit means they will aggressively defend feeding territories against rivals, moving at speed across tree trunks and canopy with their extraordinary adhesive toe pads, which rank among the most effective of any gecko species, and allow them to accelerate across virtually any surface. In captivity, they are spectacular display animals, but resist regular handling, typically thrashing and occasionally shedding their tails when restrained. Chihuahua gecko. The Chihuahua gecko is sometimes called the mossy prehensile-tailed gecko, and both parts of that name are doing meaningful descriptive work, because this New Caledonian species combines intricate green, brown, and white patterning that mimics lichen-covered bark with a fully prehensile tail that functions as a secure fifth limb when navigating the forest canopy. Adults reach 8 to 10 inches, and two distinct populations exist, from the main island and from the Isle of Pines, with the latter being notably different in base coloration and pattern intensity, creating clear locality-based morph variation that is well recognized among dedicated keepers. Slower moving and notably more docile in temperament than many of its New Caledonian relatives, the Chihuahua is popular among experienced reptile collectors who are willing to invest in specialized care requirements for a species that remains less available than crested or gargoyle geckos. New Caledonia's extensive nickel mining operations and the introduction of invasive predators have degraded significant portions of its forest habitat, and conservation status requires ongoing monitoring. New Caledonian giant gecko. The New Caledonian giant gecko is the largest living gecko species in the world, and it wears that title with appropriate gravitas, with large adults reaching 14 to 17 inches in total length and weighing close to 400 grams, a mass more reminiscent of a small bird than most people's mental image of a gecko. Endemic to New Caledonia, this species produces an unsettling vocal repertoire of growls, barks, whimpers, and hisses that are acoustically unlike any other gecko, and that contributed directly to indigenous Kanak traditions describing it as a forest spirit or supernatural entity. Two primary locality variants are recognized, from the mainland and from the Isle of Pines, and these populations differ visibly enough in size, build, and coloration that they were once treated as separate species. The massive head relative to body size is one of the most immediate striking features, giving this gecko a distinctly heavyweight appearance. In captivity, individuals are reported to reach 20 or more years under proper care, making them one of the longer-lived gecko species available to dedicated keepers. Banded gecko. The banded gecko holds a meaningful distinction in North American herpetology as the only member of the family Epelophoridae native to the continent, sharing movable eyelids and clawed pad-free feet with its distant Asian relative, the leopard gecko, but occupying the rocky canyons, desert scrub, sandy washes of the American Southwest. Adults reach 4 to 6 inches and are found across Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, and Baja California, sheltering beneath rocks and in crevices during the day and emerging after dark to hunt small invertebrates.
One of the more intriguing behaviors attributed to the species is a defensive posture in which it curls its tail over its back and waves it slowly, a movement that some researchers suggest mimics the threat display of a scorpion and may deter predators, though this interpretation remains debated in
the literature. Several subspecies exist across its range, including Variegatus, Abati, Bogerti, and Utahensis, each with subtle differences in banding pattern and dorsal coloration reflecting local adaptation. Pale yellow or cream with clean brown banding, the banded gecko is an elegant and understated species that most residents of its range have never noticed despite living alongside it. Asian house gecko. The Asian house gecko may be the single most geographically widespread lizard on Earth, having established itself on every continent except Antarctica and Europe, through accidental transport via shipping containers, cargo, and human movement, a dispersal success story with almost no parallel among reptiles. Native to South and Southeast Asia, adults reach 3 to 5 inches and produce a familiar soft chirping vocalization that has become the default nighttime background sound in households across the Pacific, the Indian Ocean Rim, and the Americas. In regions where it has been introduced, it competes directly with native gecko species for food and shelter space, and there is documented evidence of population declines in endemic island geckos, where the Asian house gecko has become established, though the specific mechanisms and outcomes vary by location. Reproduction is prolific, with females capable of producing multiple clutches of 2 hard-shelled eggs throughout the year, a rate that fuels explosive population growth in favorable conditions. It is simultaneously considered a nuisance by some and a welcome insect controller by others, demonstrating how cultural context shapes perception of the same animal. Mourning gecko. The mourning gecko has solved the problem that stymies most animal species, which is how to colonize remote islands without any assistance, by dispensing with males entirely. This small gecko, with adults reaching just 2.5 to 3.5 inches, reproduces through obligate parthenogenesis, meaning populations consist entirely of females producing genetically identical offspring without fertilization, and this reproductive strategy is believed to be central to its remarkable natural dispersal across Pacific island chains, including Hawaii, Flatchy, and Samoa, extending to coastal Central America. Genetic analysis has revealed that what appears to be a single widespread species is actually composed of multiple distinct parthenogenetic lineage with different evolutionary origins, each clonal line essentially a self-perpetuating genetic snapshot. The brown and darker chevron-patterned body is cryptic, rather than showy, and the species is small and secretive enough that many of the islands it inhabits have not had its presence formally documented, despite it likely being widespread. It produces surprisingly loud chirping vocalization for its size, and is active nocturnally, hunting small invertebrates across bark, leaf litter, and human structures with equal willingness. Stump-toed gecko. The stump-toed gecko gets its common name from a habit that is immediately visible on most adult individuals encountered in the wild, a tendency to autotomize or voluntarily drop toes when grabbed rather than the tail, leaving many adults with multiple stubbed or partial digits across their 4 feet. Sacrifice they make to escape predation. Adults reach 4 to 5.5 inches and are native to South and Southeast Asia, but like the Asian house gecko have established themselves across the Pacific, including Hawaii, parts of the Caribbean, and East Africa, through accidental transport, where both the stump-toed gecko and the Asian house gecko have been introduced to the same location. They compete directly for food and shelter resources, with local habitat characteristics often determining which species predominates. The vocalization of this species is a soft clicking sound rather than the sharper chirp of its hemidactylous relatives, giving it a more subtle acoustic presence in shared urban habitats. Genetic studies suggest the current single-species taxonomy of Cura mutilata may be masking multiple cryptic species with separate evolutionary histories, a question that ongoing molecular research is working to resolve. From here on, temperament, permits, and specialized environments start doing the filtering. These are not animals you handle. Tokay gecko. The tokay gecko announces itself before you ever see it, because this species produces a loud unmistakable syllable call that sounds almost exactly like tokay, repeated insistently into the tropical night, from somewhere above your head. Native to South and Southeast Asia, the tokay is one of the largest gecko species in the world, with adults commonly reaching 10 to 14 inches and possessing a biting force that is genuinely disproportionate to their body size. They are aggressively territorial, and unlike many gecko species that will flee when handled, tokays tend to stand their ground, open their mouths wide to display vivid pink-red interior coloration, and then bite, holding on with a grip that is difficult to break. Visually, they are extraordinary, with a blue-gray body covered in vivid orange and red spots and deep red eyes with vertical pupils that catch light in low-visibility conditions. Tokay geckos play an interesting dual role in human culture across their native range. They are considered good luck omens in many Southeast Asian households, where their calls are welcomed, but they are also heavily targeted by illegal wildlife traders due to unfounded claims about their medicinal value, placing significant pressure on wild populations in parts of their range. Flying gecko. The flying gecko of Southeast Asia has evolved one of the most unusual physical adaptations in the entire gecko family, developing extensive webbing between the toes, along the flanks of the body, and along the margins of the tail to create a natural parachute capable of carrying the animal irreproachfully 40 feet in a controlled glide between trees. Native to Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, adults reach 6 to 8 inches and are almost exclusively arboreal, rarely descending to the forest floor under natural conditions. The gliding ability is used primarily as an escape mechanism when threatened by predators, with the gecko launching from a tree trunk, spreading its webbed limbs, and descending at a shallow angle to a landing point farther down the same tree or on a neighboring one. When it rests against bark during the day, the dorsal patterning of gray and brown mimics tree bark so effectively that the gecko becomes nearly invisible, even to observers specifically searching for it, and the flattened body posture eliminates most visible shadow. Its unusual morphology has made it a popular subject of interest among both herpetologists and enthusiasts, though it is less commonly kept in captivity than other Southeast Asian species. Ring-tailed gecko. The ring-tailed gecko belongs to Cyrtodactylus, the largest gecko genus in the world, a group currently estimated at well over 300 described species, and still growing rapidly as new populations across Asia and the Pacific are formally described and named each year. Found across tropical rainforest edges and gallery forests in Papua New Guinea and northeastern Queensland. The ring-tailed gecko is slender and arboreal, using curved, non-adhesive claws rather than toe pads to grip tree bark and branches, and the brown and cream banding pattern on its tail creates the ringed or barred appearance that gives it its common name. Adults reach 7 to 10 inches and are nocturnal, making them difficult to observe in the field, despite being present across a reasonably broad range. The staggering diversity of Cyrtodactylus as a whole represents one of the most impressive examples of adaptive radiation in the lizard world, with species occupying habitats from lowland tropical rainforest to high-altitude montane forest across South, Southeast, and East Asia, each finding slightly different ecological footholds within what appears at a glance to be a morphologically conservative body plan. Giant bent-toed gecko. The giant bent-toed gecko represents the upper end of the Cyrtodactylus size spectrum, with adults estimated at approximately 10 to 12 inches, making it a substantially larger animal than most of its hundreds of genus relatives. Found in primary and secondary lowland rainforests across Borneo, an island shared politically between Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei. This species is typically encountered on large-diameter tree trunks and structural forest elements at night, hunting invertebrates with the unhurried patience of an ambushed predator confident in its own camouflage. Large tubercles across the dorsal surface give it a more textured and armored appearance than smaller Cyrtodactylus relatives, and its brown banding with darker contrast blends effectively into the deeply shadowed tree bark of Bornean primary forest. The gecko fauna of Borneo remains incompletely surveyed, meaning the exact taxonomic status and range boundaries of several large Cyrtodactylus species are still being refined by researchers, and the conservation challenge of protecting species across 3 separate national jurisdictions with varying levels of forest protection adds additional complexity. Wonder gecko. The wonder gecko, also called the frog-eyed gecko, earns both names immediately upon first encounter because the eyes of this Central Asian desert specialist are so proportionally enormous relative to the head that they dominate the face completely, giving the animal an expression of permanent wide-eyed astonishment. Found across the arid landscapes of Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan and extending into Central Asia as far as northwestern China. Adults reach 5 to 7 inches and possess an unusual adaptation found in no other gecko. The dorsal scales are oversized and plate-like, overlapping like fish scales rather than lying flat, and when the gecko is threatened, it can rub these scales together to produce an audible rasping or stridulation sound as a warning display. The full threat response is theatrical, involving an arched body posture, raised tail, and the stridulation noise produced simultaneously, a combination that makes this small sandy-colored lizard appear considerably more formidable than its size alone would suggest. In captivity, the wonder gecko requires specialized dry desert conditions, quite different from the tropical or semi-tropical setups used for more popular gecko species, placing it firmly in the specialist category. Bronze gecko. Bronze gecko is the armored heavyweight of southern African gecko fauna, a robustly built species reaching 7 to 9 inches whose skin is so densely covered in raised conical tubercles that it feels rough and spiky to the touch, a texture that likely makes it difficult for predators to swallow comfortably. Found across rocky outcrops, coastal scrub, and arid savanna in South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, and southern Angola. This species is notably feisty in temperament, known for biting vigorously, when handled and producing audible defensive squeaks while doing so, a combination that discourages casual interference. The large wide-angled head relative to body size gives it considerable bite force that complements its aggressive defensive posture, and the mottled brownish-gray patterning provides reasonable camouflage against the lichen-covered granite and sandstone outcrops it favors. Multiple gecko species often share the same rock formation in southern Africa, and Biberon's gecko coexists with several smaller relatives by exploiting the larger, more exposed rock face positions that smaller species avoid. Wildlife protection regulations in South Africa limit export, keeping this species relatively rare in international collections, despite its considerable appeal to enthusiasts who prefer their geckos with attitude. Knob-tailed gecko. The knob-tailed gecko is immediately identifiable by a feature found nowhere else in the lizard world, a very short, stubby, carrot-shaped tail ending in a small round ball or knob, as if someone had capped a miniature baseball bat with a marble. Endemic to Australia. The genus Nephurus contains approximately 8 recognized species, each occupying slightly different microhabitats across the arid interior of Western Australia, South Australia, and the Northern Territory, from sandy spinifex desert to rocky outcrop country. These are fully terrestrial animals, using burrows and rock crevices for shelter and emerging at night to hunt invertebrates with the large golden amber eyes characteristic of a serious low-light predator. The function of the distinctive knobtail is not definitively established, with potential roles including distraction of predators, species recognition, and fat storage suggested in the literature, though none has been conclusively confirmed. Export of Australian native wildlife is strictly prohibited, without permits, making legally sourced knob-tailed geckos in international collections rare and correspondingly valuable. Barking gecko. The barking gecko of the Kalahari and Namib regions is responsible for one of the most remarkable wildlife sound events in Africa, because males of this species call from the entrances of their individual burrows at dusk in aggregations that can reach thousands of individuals per hectare, creating a rolling pulsing chorus of clicks and barks that carries across the open desert landscape for considerable distances. Adults reach just 3 to 4.5 inches, making the collective volume of these aggregations even more impressive relative to the size of the animals producing it. And the calling behavior is explicitly competitive, with males attempting to out-signal rivals to attract females moving between burrow territories. Strictly fossorial for shelter, barking geckos dig individual burrows in sandy substrate across the southern Kalahari and Namib margins, emerging each evening in a predictable sequence, time to light levels. The calling aggregations documented within and around Kalahari Gemsbok National Park in South Africa and in Namibia have attracted interest from behavioral ecologists studying acoustic competition and signal evolution. Outside of calling and mating activity, these small sandy brown lizards are cryptic and easily overlooked, their plain coloration offering essentially no clue to the extraordinary collective performance they produce each evening. Cave gecko. The cave geckos of the genus Goneirosaurus are among the most visually striking members of the broader leopard gecko family, displaying bold banding of orange, black, and white or yellow across a smooth, velvety skin that has an almost luminescent quality under direct light. Closely related to leopard geckos, and sharing the movable eyelids and clawed pad-free feet of that family, Goneirosaurus species are adapted not to hot deserts, but to the cool, humid limestone karst formations and cave systems of southern China, Vietnam, Laos, and the Ryukyu Islands of Japan. Dramatic ecological departure from their arid-adapted relatives. Approximately 25 species are currently described in the genus, several of which have known ranges so restricted that the entire wild population may occupy a single cave system or small cluster of karst outcrops, making them extraordinarily vulnerable to targeted collection. That vulnerability is actively exploited by illegal wildlife traders, because the combination of striking appearance, secretive habits, and restricted range means that targeted collection can effectively strip a population before conservation authorities are even aware of the pressure. Japanese island populations from the Ryukyu chain represents some of the most geographically isolated representatives of the genus, separated from mainland relatives by open ocean and evolving in partial isolation for significant geological time, and now the ones almost nobody keeps. Some because the care is brutally precise, some because they are barely studied, and one because owning it would be a crime. Mossy leaf-tailed gecko. The mossy leaf-tailed gecko is widely considered one of the most extraordinarily camouflaged animals on Earth, and that reputation is fully earned, because this Madagascar endemic does not merely resemble bark or moss in a general sense, but replicates the color variation, surface texture, and lichen patterns of specific tree species, with a precision that makes experienced naturalists do double takes. Found in mid to high altitude rainforests across Madagascar, this member of the genus Euplatus, which contains over 20 recognized species, presses its flattened body against tree trunks during daylight hours and deploys a dermal flap running along the edges of its body to eliminate the telltale shadow that would otherwise reveal its presence to predators. Adults reach 4 to 6 inches, and they are strictly nocturnal, merging after dark to hunt insects using sit-and-wait ambush tactics from low vegetation and forest debris. Madagascar's accelerating deforestation poses a serious and ongoing threat to wild populations, as these geckos are tightly tied to intact primary forest and do not adapt well to degraded habitat. In captivity, they require extremely specific humidity and temperature parameters that place them firmly in the specialist category. Satanic leaf-tailed gecko. The satanic leaf-tailed gecko has a name that its appearance fully justifies, because this tiny Madagascar endemic has horn-like projections above its eyes, blood-red irises, and a tail shaped with unsettling precision to resemble a dried, partially decomposed leaf, complete with simulated veining, irregular edges, and what appear to be bite marks and holes along the margin. Despite being one of the smallest Euplatus species, with a body length of just 2.5 to 3.5 inches, it relies entirely on this visual deception rather than size or speed for survival, remaining completely motionless during the day and trusting its camouflage to do the work. Found in the northeastern and central eastern rainforests of Madagascar, this species has a restricted natural range that makes it particularly sensitive to habitat loss, and the combination of deforestation and collection pressure from the exotic pet trade creates compounding threats to wild populations. The tail shape is believed to function as a combination of camouflage and deflection, drawing predator attention away from the vulnerable head and body toward a less critical appendage that can be sacrificed if needed. Web-footed gecko. The web-footed gecko of Namibia's Skeleton Coast is a masterclass in desert adaptation, having evolved oversized webbed feet that function like natural snowshoes on loose desert sand, distributing body weight so effectively that the animal can sprint across dune surfaces that would trap most small vertebrates. Native to the coastal Namib Desert, one of the driest environments on Earth, this species also harvests drinking water directly from the Atlantic coastal fog by tilting its body and allowing condensation to run down its skin toward its mouth, a behavior that is one of the more remarkable foraging adaptations documented in any lizard. Adults reach 4 to 5 inches and are characterized by proportionally enormous dark eyes that enable navigation and hunting in the near-total darkness of Namibian desert nights, when fog events typically occur and insect prey becomes active. The fog harvesting behavior has attracted genuine interest from biomimetics researchers studying passive water collection systems inspired by biological models. The animal's pale pinkish or sandy coloration, combined with those translucent, oversized feet, gives it an almost alien appearance against the rust-colored Namib dune fields. Namib sand gecko. The Namib sand gecko occupies an even more extreme section of the Namib Desert than its web-footed relative, surviving in near-total sand dune environments, where surface temperatures during the day can reach levels lethal to most small ectotherms. This species performs a remarkable thermal regulation behavior, sometimes called the hot sand dance, alternately lifting opposite pairs of feet off the scorching substrate in rapid sequence to reduce heat transfer from the sand into the body, buying the animal additional active time during crepuscular periods. Adults reach approximately 3.5 to 4.5 inches, primarily on small insects attracted to the sparse desert vegetation that stabilizes the dune margins, using patient ambush strategies that minimize energy expenditure in a habitat where calories are scarce. The Namib sand gecko is part of the Pachydaktylus genus, a large southern African group containing over 50 described species across a wide range of habitat types, and ongoing taxonomic revisions continue to refine the relationships between members of this genus. Its survival strategies represent a compelling case of convergent evolution, with desert lizards on other continents facing similar thermal and hydration challenges. Clawless gecko. The clawless gecko holds the modest but meaningful distinction of being Australia's smallest gecko species, with adults reaching just 1.5 to 2 inches in body length, a size that makes it genuinely easy to overlook in the field and contributes to how poorly understood this species remains relative to many of its Australian gecko relatives. Found under leaf litter, bark slabs, and in rock crevices across coastal and interior Western Australia and South Australia. This member of the family Diplodactylidae lacks the functional claws present in most other gecko species and instead relies on smooth ventral toe surfaces for movement across the substrate. The combination of tiny size, cryptic brown and speckled coloration, and secretive sheltering habits makes field encounters uncommon, and population status has not been comprehensively characterized for most of its range. It is rarely encountered in the pet trade due to export restrictions on Australian wildlife and the practical difficulties of keeping such a small delicate species in captivity. Its existence is a useful reminder that gecko diversity extends as much toward the small and hidden as it does toward the large and spectacular. Rock semaphore gecko. The rock semaphore gecko, belonging to the genus Pristurus across the Arabian Peninsula and Horn of Africa, communicates in a way that is unlike most other gecko species, using a complex repertoire of tail curls and lateral waving movements to signal rivals, potential mates, territorial boundaries across the open rocky terrain it inhabits. The semaphore in the name is not casual, because researchers studying this behavior have identified distinct signal sequences associated with different behavioral contexts, suggesting a level of structured visual communication that approaches what could meaningfully be called a gesture vocabulary. Adults reach 3 to 5 inches and are fully diurnal, hunting small invertebrates across sun-exposed rock faces and talus slopes in some of the hottest terrestrial environments inhabited by any gecko species, including the deserts of Yemen, Oman, Somalia, and Eritrea, and the extraordinary biological refuge of Socotra Island. The genus Pristurus contains approximately 20 to 25 recognized species across this range, with Socotra Island populations representing some of the most isolated, living alongside the island's other globally unique endemic wildlife. The tail signaling behavior makes this genus one of the most behaviorally interesting in the gecko family, and one of the most rewarding to observe in the field for anyone with the patience to find and watch them at work. And at the very top of the list is the gecko that no amount of experience entitles you to own. The electric blue day gecko is genuinely one of the most visually dramatic reptiles on Earth, with males displaying an iridescent blue coloration of such intensity that first-time observers frequently describe it as unreal or digitally enhanced, a living jewel barely 2 to 3 inches long, clinging to a screw pine in a small forest fragment in Tanzania. Females are olive green or brownish with a pale underside, demonstrating pronounced sexual dichromatism within a species where the males are among the most vividly colored vertebrates in Africa. The entire wild population is restricted to approximately 4 square kilometers of the Kimboza forest in the Morogoro region of Tanzania, a habitat area so small that a single significant disturbance event could devastate the species entirely, and the combination of this tiny range with intense pressure from the illegal pet trade has pushed the species to critically endangered status on the IUCN Red List. Despite that status, demand in the exotic pet trade remains high and illegal collection continues to represent a serious and ongoing threat to wild survival. Conservation efforts are active, collaborating against significant economic and enforcement pressures in the region. 30 geckos, 4 tiers, and honestly, you only needed to know about 3 of them. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.